Okay, so let's get started. Welcome everyone to the first episode of Yale's Blockchain and Cryptocurrency webinar series hosted by the International Center for Finance. I'm Diana, I'm an MBA alum and currently advising on regulatory issues in the blockchain and crypto space. And I'm delighted to be joined by Greg Lisa, partner at Hogan Lovells, who specializes in AML for the fintech and casino industry. So welcome, Greg.
Hi, it's really good to be here. Thank you so much for the invite. I really wanted to thank you, Diana, and also Electra for putting all this together. This is a great opportunity. Really happy to be here.
So why don't we get started?
Sure. Which means I think we've got to jump the first hoops of switching screen sharing, which yes. In case folks were wondering, I am as dumb as I look. So either I disconnect all of us or I share a screen at just about now.
There you go.
Which way did it happen? Okay.
Perfect.
That's great. No, thank you very much. So I think we were going to spend most of this evening, and again, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight. We're going to talk about crypto and how its association with illicit activities, and also in many ways, I spent a good chunk of my career playing cops and robbers. I was an organized crime prosecutor for DOJ before going off to one financial regulator, and then most recently, before coming to the firm, I was over at I was the interim head of compliance and enforcement over at FinCEN, which is the Treasury Department's lead US AML regulator. In addition to overseeing banks and casinos and card clubs and broker dealers, they also have a lot of regulatory oversight over the cryptocurrency industry. And I think between that and my criminal background, especially doing money laundering cases, really drew me to this space, which is I think how, Diana, you and I intersected.
Exactly.
So very good to see you again for this.
Lovely. So let's start with the first question, which is blockchain and cryptocurrencies are often associated with illicit activity. Is that reputation justified? What do you think, Greg?
You know, it's definitely gotten its share of headlines, right? I love, by the way, that one on the this one over here, the one on the right, where CNBC describes a robot with $100 in Bitcoin. They just love the headline description of that and getting arrested. But I think largely it is, I think what we're talking about is a reputational issue that crypto has had. I think some of it's been deserved, frankly, and some of it hasn't been. There's a lot of very promising and legitimate uses in this space. But it certainly has, as many new industries have, gotten a bad reputation by some illicit uses, including connections with the dark web, connections with terror cells and drug dealers, and it's not at all surprising that that's what makes it to the top of the headlines. I think also largely you look at, so there was an Oxford study put out a couple of years ago by this guy, Sean Foley and others, who said this, so it was something in the neighborhood of 46% of all Bitcoin transactions. There have been some questions. I have some questions about really how you attribute that 46% of all those transactions, but you certainly have had a good share of public officials, including the FBI director, the head of Treasury, the head of IRS criminal investigation, pointing out how crypto has really not just changed the landscape for them, but how it's been used for illicit purposes, including tax evasion and sanctions evasion and use of illicit drugs. It's not at all surprising that when you hear the FBI director point about it, they say, like, from an investigative perspective, there's an issue here about following the money. And Treasury Secretary Mnuchin said that this is a national security issue, pointing out kind of all the, in his estimation, billions of dollars supported in illicit activity. Connected to everything from cyber events to drug trafficking to money laundering.
Exactly.
And of course, we have one of our biggest proponents, right? I mean, there's nothing. One of the biggest scholars in this space sent out a tweet not 13, 14 months ago, saying that not only is he not a fan, but everything is based in that space is based on thin air and how it can facilitate unlawful activity, including drug trafficking and so on and so forth. So I remember when this tweet made out, and it really made a lot of headlines in the space. I think it did affect the price of Bitcoin for a little while. But it's no matter what, it has definitely gathered a lot of headlines of the possible illicit uses. And I think that there's an argument there that where people have seen criminal cases and criminals turning to illicit use or turning to virtual currencies for illicit use, that they say, hey, listen, maybe this technology isn't so good after all.
Exactly, and that's exactly to the next question that I was going to ask you about what about cryptocurrencies and virtual currencies make them so susceptible to criminal activity, and you're exactly touching upon that point.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that again, Director Wray had been talking about, the FBI director, was that look, when criminal investigators are prosecuting any case, looking at any case, and you think of it, other than purely ideological crimes like eco activism and ideological terrorism, things that have no kind of profit motive, and crimes of passion, like those two narrow exceptions, everything is motivated by money, or at least requires a significant amount of money or some amount of money to facilitate. So a criminal investigator, an FBI agent or a DEA agent or IRS agent, they're typically looking at doing one thing, which is following the money. That's how you draw connections between people. That's how you see the motivation behind something. That's how you connect people to businesses, to other people. And you see sometimes how the leadership of an organization is structured by seeing where the money flows are, or where their next activities are, illicit or otherwise, by seeing where the money goes out to. So I think when Director Wray was talking about that, when the FBI director was talking about that, that his concern was that crypto is, some people say anonymous. It's not anonymous, but it's pseudonymous. So there's not a necessary connection between a name and a transaction in the same way that you would with a bank account. And there are some very novel aspects of this space. People, if folks remember the big ICO hype, there was a lot of fraud. There was a lot of speculation in that space, and a lot of people lost a lot of money. There were some prosecutions, but I think a lot of people understandably saw the big ICO boom as a big breeding ground for fraud. And you also see in some jurisdictions, crypto exchanges are largely unregulated. So they see this as this kind of an area of people being able to transact sometimes significant amounts of money with no traceability at all. At least that's a perception. And when you think of it, think back a couple of years ago to the internet. I mean, who initially populated the internet? I mean, the internet was basically, it wasn't eBay and Amazon and things like that. It was basically two industries, largely. It was mostly fraud and porn, and not in that order, by the way. I mean, that's basically was the largest ecosystem within the internet, was that. It was kind of the unseemly side of society, and sometimes criminal side of society. And one of my colleagues, actually, she is very active in this space, Katie Hawn. She's a partner at Andreessen Horowitz. She's on the board of Coinbase, and she pointed out that criminals are. She's also a former prosecutor like me. That criminals are some of the best beta testers. They have a different. They can be very innovative. They look for opportunity. And sometimes they can be very technologically savvy at looking where there's an opportunity for fraud, or ways to make money, or to invest their money, or to move their money in novel ways. So I think that's something that you look at the crypto industry and you say, or the cryptocurrency ecosystem, and you say, look, if I'm a criminal, maybe this is one area where I had to look at, because maybe I'll be able to disseminate funds or collect funds, using this instead of trying to go through bank accounts and wire transfers and other things where law enforcement and bank compliance officers and others are performing heavy surveillance, for lack of a better term.
Right. So let's move on now and really ask you, because there's been so much excitement, so really, is it all that bad? And what about investigations involving crypto? And are there some aspects of blockchain technology that make it actually better for criminal investigations from what you've seen? And I know you have interesting stories, so I want to pick your brain.
No, thanks. I don't think it's all that bad. As a matter of fact, I think there are some things, and if you talk to it's a small, very growing cadre of investigators in this space. Look, I've been out of government now for 4 years, and after being in for the bulk of my career for 17 years, and people ask me whether I miss it, and it's like, yeah, I miss it every single day. I miss it when I wake up in the morning. I used to go into work then, I can't believe they pay me to do this stuff, right? You get to play cops and robbers all the time, and there are some fantastic investigators out there. And prosecutors and special agents, both state and federal, especially the ones doing complex money laundering and illicit finance investigations. And there's a group of them right now who are looking at, especially around crypto. There's a group out of the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, some out of the San Francisco U.S. Attorney's Office, and again, both state and federal. They're very innovative themselves, and also incredibly aggressive and thoughtful. But you look at basically what is a typical criminal investigation, especially a complex criminal investigation, not just a bank robbery, not just a single shooting that's isolated, not a buy bust drug deal, but you look at an organizational type of crime, like organized crime, or a drug cartel, or a human trafficking ring. This takes, again, money to incentivize and money to operate, and so that's why that mantra that many prosecutors have, which is, look, you follow the money. And you do that, you can disrupt the organization, you can dismantle the organization, you could stop crime at its roots as opposed to just the symptoms. In a typical criminal investigation, you're going to have certain tools. So not a crypto, just a regular investigation. You can pull documents, issue grand jury subpoenas, you can maybe do some search warrants, you develop witnesses and insiders and informants, maybe you get an undercover. If you want to get records from overseas, from a bank transaction, you've got to avail yourself of what's called the MLAT, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, or a rogatory letter for foreign records. It's an incredibly cumbersome process to go through all that, to develop a wiretap, incredibly intensive. And also, frankly, it's not always foolproof. Witnesses lie, including some witnesses that you've known for a long time. They lie or they make mistakes. Records go missing. People forge documents. Informants forget, or they have some incentive or some axe to grind that you've never heard about. And there's a real question sometimes about the reliability of your information, about the permanence of your information. And also whether or not you can even get it. Trying to get foreign bank records is an exercise in dentistry sometimes, just how difficult it is to try to track down, to go to a jurisdiction and say, hey, listen, can you give us bank records about one of your citizens from one of your banks? And look, there's some hospitable jurisdictions and some not. I once prosecuted, I can't give you his name, but I once prosecuted this professional money launderer. And that was basically his job. He was a professional money launderer. He worked for organizations, overseas organizations, and he wasn't a U.S. Citizen. And I still remember once, there was an FBI agent who sat back and he said, such and such, the thing that gets me is you have no respect for international boundaries. And he looked down. He He wasn't like a tough guy or anything like that. He was basically a glorified accountant that was really good at laundering money. And he said, Agent such and such, like, you got it all wrong. It's like, I know boundaries. I know exactly what airports I can go to without getting extradited. I know exactly what banks in which jurisdictions will never share records with you. I know which nations will notify me before they notify you about an Interpol alert on my name. It's like, I am highly respectful of these international boundaries because I have to play among them. I've got to like find my way through the cracks in the system to launder this money. By then, by the way, he was cooperating with us, but he said like, no, I am highly cognizant of all this because I know how difficult it is for you to investigate these cases. You know, I think it's fair to say that many typical investigations never get cracked because of things like money laundering techniques, shell corporations, because of unreliability of evidence or the inaccessibility of evidence. And that's in your typical. Put this in contrast. And by the way, this bottom line, I love this one. Smoking guns, in a complex case, forget about a smoking gun. You build these cases brick by brick. And the problem is if you can't get that brick because that financial record is in Moldova and the Moldovan government isn't going to give it to you, or because this witness is lying, or because this document, you can't tell if it's forgery or real, that can be existential for a criminal investigation. So you break it down, it's basically those three things, right? It's you know, evidence goes away, evidence is unreliable, or evidence, you just can't get it. It's just inaccessible, or it takes too long to get. And by the time you get it, your statute of limitations is run. One thing that I think is, this sounds nerdy, so forgive me, but that's kind of how I roll. I really do think it's beautiful about this because, you know, I love anti-money laundering work. I love criminal investigation, and I really do treasure this space, the crypto ecosystem. You look at it, and if you're a criminal investigator, you can look at how blockchain is not the solution for everything, but it does provide three things, right? You know, or at least, you know, absent something dramatic, you know, the blockchain evidence is going to be reliable. It's already been verified by at least 51%, or whatever the litmus is for that particular blockchain. It's also immutable. In other words, you know, there's nothing, you can't go back and erase a record. It is because of its decentralized nature. You would have to essentially go to thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, perhaps more computers to essentially change that record. And then finally, it's accessible. You know, if you're a law enforcement agent, an investigator, you don't have to send a diplomatic request for information overseas. You don't have to try to litigate with a bank's in-house counsel whether or not they're going to respect this subpoena. Much of this information, this transactional information, is highly transparent. I'm not saying completely transparent because, again, it's pseudonymous. You still need to have some other pieces of your puzzle there. But largely, you're able to do some pieces of, significant pieces of your criminal investigation, of your financial investigation, that would never, ever be possible in this regime.
Right, I love what you're saying, Greg. And I think to me, one thing that always has struck me is how in the traditional finance space, in the anti-money laundering and compliance teams, there's like 90+% rates of false positives in STRs and things like that. And it's like that, and it's always been like that, and 90% is just being nice. And that's something that I find absolutely crazy. But moving forward, what are some of the examples that you've seen where you've used these attributes for these investigations?
Yeah, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a spectacular trick, which is not use any of my own investigations because I could get in trouble. But what I can do is rely on the public accounts of some other investigations that I've been, you know, aware of, so let me just show a couple of those, including some that are from recent memory. Here's one, which was it's the Jung Soo Wan case, Jung Soo Wan case. Forgive me for misspeaking. And the case, this man was the operator of this website called Welcome to Video. It was, at least by volume of content, it was known as the largest volume of kiddie porn, of child exploitation material. It was located on a darknet server. And essentially, this is an excerpt from the indictment, which talks about, among other things, how and by the way, almost all payments were in virtual currency, and the indictment goes into some detail of describing both this case was brought in 2019. They charged at least 337 users in addition to the operator of this. And it describes in some detail how blockchain analysis was used to identify both the money flows as well as how those different wallets that people had used. So instead of creating, just transferring money from one account to another, they basically, spread them out, sometimes over 100 different wallets, to basically try to fly under the radar and make them look like individual minor transactions of sometimes a tiny fraction of a Bitcoin at a time. And so what the investigators, both private and public investigators, we'll talk about that in a little bit, what the investigators were able to do in that case was to analyze those transactions and, by uses of databases, establish the connections into different clusters. So it allowed the identification of all of those Bitcoin addresses and essentially saying, yeah, this is the same person. This is essentially the same wallet. That's or effectively they said it was the same user for that receiving or sending all those transactions. And so basically this website received about 7,300 transactions in a couple year period, worth at the time over 370,000. The purveyor himself, Mr. Sun, has been convicted and is presently serving in South Korea. It spanned, I think, every continent. I know that they had users in the US, all over the US, UK, South Korea, the UAE, Czech Republic, Canada, Ireland, Australia, where there were charges brought. It was a large international investigation. But for the fact that they were had all been using Bitcoin and had those transactions brought on the blockchain, there's no way in the world. I'm not saying they wouldn't have caught some of these individuals. They might have caught the lead individual, but there's no way in the world they could have created this spider web of transactions to show who in fact was sending. Both some of them were actually sending kiddie porn into the site, but a really remarkable investigation that went on there. This, by the way, is the list of some of the addresses where they collected and they sought to forfeit those accounts. Some were in US dollars, some were in, if you see on the right-hand side, there's a Bitcoin and I think ETH as well as Litecoin, because they're trying to collect some of that money to go to the victims. And so that's one. And look, I mean, to some extent you say, look, how is Bitcoin or is virtual currency bad? Well, it was used to help facilitate this in a darknet marketplace. It also served to be kind of the tools for its undoing, because it basically gave criminal investigators the roadmap to be able to say, here are the 337 users of this. We're able to follow the money and trace these transactions back to the primary user and the purveyor on this website.
Right. You hear of cases where they market Bitcoin and virtual currencies because they're anonymous as a way of doing these things, but there's also transparency. There's also immutability, which you can leverage in interesting ways.
Yeah, exactly right. And look, the bad guys are really sophisticated too, right? So there are technologies. There are some privacy coins. There are some technologies to put things into mixers and tumblers to help to layer those transactions to make it challenging for law enforcement to keep up and to trace everything. There are some non-compliant exchanges so that you might be able to determine, for instance, that this account received a whole bunch of Bitcoin and it was connected to all these other bad people, or that they received the proceeds of a hack or something like that. That doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to identify who the owner of that is. That still takes some other steps, including going to exchanges, developing your traditional information, your investigative information, to be able to associate, this Bitcoin address or this ETH wallet with Greg Lisa or whoever it is you're trying to trace down. But the transactional flow, as you were talking about, the transactional information, you're absolutely right, is all there. It's all there. Right. And that wouldn't happen in a regular investigation. And that's just one example. Here's another one. DOJ had looked at a whole bunch of terror cells, including some affiliated with ISIS, as well as Al-Qaeda and Hamas. And they had, this was, I think, in August, they announced the dismantling of these 3 terror finance cells and cyber-enabled campaigns. And it's interesting because when they did the investigation into these cells themselves, into these terror cells, many of the terrorists themselves were issuing instructions on how to give virtual currency donations. That, again, this is an excerpt from the indictment, how the blockchain itself served as a public ledger, which allowed them to trace the terrorists in that case. Now let's just jump to one more, if you can indulge me, which is this. I don't know how many folks here recently remember it just last month, or I'm sorry, now 2 months ago, the Twitter hack. You see a whole bunch of people, including people like Kanye and Kim Kardashian and Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Elon Musk and Bill Gates, all of a sudden in this simultaneous display of generosity said, hey, listen, you know what? I'm ready to give it all back. You send me to this address, and if you can see on the screen, to this address, send me a certain amount of Bitcoin, and I'll send you double back. And amazingly enough, a number of people did. They did exactly that. They sent it, and again, it took Twitter a little while to shut down those accounts. It took some of the Twitter the account holders themselves to say, this wasn't me. Do not give any money to this. As it turned out, what had happened was that there was a couple people, but really the mastermind of it was this 17-year-old kid, out of Florida, Graham Clark. I'm saying publicly because he's charged as an adult. And he was charged with 30 felony charges, including a hack into these Twitter accounts. He had a couple of co-conspirators, and they netted about, I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 12.5 Bitcoin. And some others that they almost got, but that one of the exchanges, one of the very compliant exchanges said, no, we're just going to put a halt on these transactions. So they were caught. But basically, after having hacked into basically a phishing scam, hacking into a bunch of different Twitter accounts, was able to send these out. I mean, this was actually Bill Gates's Twitter account that he sent this out on, and offering up to a bunch of people saying, for the next 30 minutes, you can double your money just because my feeling of generosity, I'm giving back to my fans. And the crypto investigators, again, both private and public, were able to look at this and essentially unpack what had been gone. This is Che Wan, who is the, I think his name was Shepherd in the UK, sends this transaction is him sending about 3.7 Bitcoin to in this transaction. And they're basically able to trace in very real time, and it's detailed very nicely in the indictment about how they were able to unwind this in a very short amount of time. That's why the arrest typically a cyber intrusion can sometimes take years to unravel. This one, they were able to put people into custody in a function of a couple of weeks. As a matter of fact, that's what the FBI special agent in charge did. Can I do one more just to do a little show and tell?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So a couple of months ago, actually last year was the actual hack. So there were two hacks brought out of North Korea onto some virtual currency exchanges. I love this just because, again, these are all just excerpts from government documents. So these are all public. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to get you the charging documents. But basically, this is what happened. So there were two hacks of various virtual currency exchanges, one in July of 2019, another one in September that same year. And essentially what they did was, after taking that virtual currency, or these multiple virtual currencies, they basically laundered them through intermediate addresses. What the investigators, both US and overseas investigators, were able to do, were able to basically connect up. I'm sorry if the slide on this is too small. It's basically an excerpt of a full page chart. Basically able to show from each of these exchanges, here's exchange 3, exchange 2, and basically show how these went from an initial theft from an exchange. These are all different types of various virtual currencies. So here's ETH over here. There's an altcoin over here called YEE, Y-E-E. Another one over here called All Sports. And if you look at it, some of these trades didn't go anywhere. But then some of them wind up getting, I forget what this, what type of coin this is, but essentially some of them wind up going and it's called chain hopping, where essentially something gets converted from one type of coin into another type of coin, and then essentially and ultimately these things wound up getting converted from one type of crypto into Bitcoin, which makes it, Bitcoin's a little bit more, it has 2/3 of the market cap. It's more easy to liquidate if you're a bad guy or if you're a good guy, and also because they're on different blockchains, sometimes it's more difficult to trace. So basically, what this and a couple of the other law enforcement charts did was trace each of these transactions from exchange to exchange and from wallet to other wallet, also identifying, as we talked before, about these clusters. So apparently unaffiliated addresses that they're able to connect by patterns and to see how often they communicate with each other, to determine that, in fact, all of these different accounts for all these different thefts wind up into this address. So I'm sorry, I know I went on a nerd.
No, this is great. Great. We do have a couple of questions, so we're going to transition to Q&A time.
Sure.
The first question is, so is the effectiveness of blockchain as a tool, does it purely matter, is it purely a matter of jurisdictional oversight?
I want to make sure I understand that question, because there's a way I can just define it out of existence, and I don't want to do that. I want to answer. One of the problems of crypto, or one way for, let's just say this, can you see my cursor swirling around? If that's where the bad guy receives all crypto, and she or he is able to cash that out in a non-compliant jurisdiction, or if that person or entity is in a non-compliant jurisdiction that isn't going to cooperate with international counterparts, or their exchanges, unlike Coinbase, which does full KYC, if they're able to get that somewhere, there's a chance of two things happening. First, there's a chance that that country just wouldn't extradite their citizen. And second, that those non-compliant exchanges would liquidate, would allow someone to convert it or move it on to another location, so you can lose the investigative trail. I hope that answers the question, but if not, That's a short way of saying, yes, to some extent it does depend on jurisdiction. It is probably less dependent on jurisdiction than your traditional financial investigative techniques.
Okay, awesome, awesome. So moving on to the next question, do we have a sense of what percentage of Bitcoin transactions are illicit? And is that percentage declining or increasing? So what's the trend?
Yeah, so two of the big investigative companies in this space, I think I had alluded to a couple times, there's a real and growing law enforcement expertise in the space, but there are also some private companies, Chainalysis being one, Elliptic and CipherTrace, and they've done some really interesting work in this space. I think it's tough to say. As you recall in the very beginning, that Sean Foley study from Oxford said, some ungodly percentage of Bitcoin transactions were illicit. I think that the most recent analysis from Chainalysis said that it is growing. But I think that was growing in an absolute, not a relative scale. Again, just because there are many more legitimate uses. So in other words, the legitimate market is growing. So there are fewer illicit purposes as a percentage of overall transactions. I think that's what it is, but don't quote me on that study. I'd have to see, I should go back and take a look at that because I don't have it at my fingertips.
Awesome, awesome. And I guess one hot topic that everybody's talking about is DeFi, decentralized finance. And here I'm actually gonna borrow a quote that I really like from Rebecca Reddig. She's a DeFi lawyer. And basically DeFi being a technological movement toward decentralizing legacy finance, financial institutions, instruments, and use cases. Basically what lessons learned and takeaways would you see happening in this space and also in fintech overall?
Yeah, so, I think, one of the questions that people are asking about DeFi is it going to go the same way as the ICO boom, when there were a whole bunch of lawyers, like really bad lawyers, like me. No, there were a whole bunch of lawyers who and by the way, first off, they weren't bad lawyers, and second, there weren't a whole bunch of them. But there was real uncertainty in this space about whether or not these, in fact, constituted securities, and also whether or not there was also a ton of hype and speculation around that space. So it really did bring out sometimes, I think, the worst in that space, because a lot of people did lose some money off of things. And I think the real question about DeFi is, what's the regulatory reaction to that going to be? Are the Treasury departments, the SECs, the CFTCs of the world going to look at that? I mean, I think there's remarkable amount of innovation and thinking in the space, covering from lending to derivatives to financial services contracts, that basically are just remarkable. Now, they don't always think through, and the regulators aren't necessarily prepared for what's going to happen, like how those should be governed. And it's very easy to say we've created something new, so the regulations don't cover it. I think that's a real risk there. That there are attempts to bring things out into the public without having fully thought through what the regulatory reaction is going to be. That's different from the illicit crime space. So there's certainly illicit finance that will happen in DeFi as well, just given the amount of speculation and hype around that, right? There already has been.
Right. So I'm going to move on to the last question. What trends do you see from a regulatory standpoint? The travel rule in Europe requires KYC, obviously, after a certain threshold of transactions. And will the US enact similar rules, and have they already?
Yes. Last question first. They already have already. The travel rule has been in place. Now, is it up to the same threshold as US? No, I think it's $3,000. for the US, if I'm remembering right. But yes, as a matter of fact, in the 2013 FinCEN guidance said that those transmissions, in fact, are covered by the travel rule, because crypto or convertible virtual currency transmission is a form of money transmission. If it meets those requirements, it will fall under the requirements of the travel rule. At the time that FATF came out with this recommendation, the US held the presidency of this group. It's called the Financial Action Task Force, intergovernmental body establishing international standards for AML. It's not by accident that the US pushed, that was a big proponent of making sure that the travel rule was put in place there. It's a way of not just having an equal playing field, but also ensuring that all of these different virtual currency exchanges, what they call them, VASPs or whatever, will communicate to each other and will share user information so that these investigations can happen. I think the implementation and enforcement of the travel rule, first off, is going to be a, not as easy as it sounds, for one. But I can see why the regulators and law enforcement are pushing so hard for it, because absent that, you can effectively have a very atomized, balkanized system where the information that you would normally get in a financial transfer above a certain transaction is has a blind spot. And so law enforcement, the receiving entity isn't able to ensure that they are able to do due diligence on whomever just sent them a whole bunch of money. And law enforcement doesn't have a line of sight into that.
Right. And also didn't FATF, I think they released a 12-month review where they're evaluating where we're at since
Yep.
they came up with the travel rule, and we're not where we should be.
Yeah, they said that there's been good progress made. I mean, this is typical FATF, right? And I love FATF. But they said there's been progress made, but still a long way to go. They also said, by the way, like a lot of people have said that we shouldn't implement the travel rule. And I said, yeah, we're still implementing the travel rule. We're still going to require that the travel rule comes into place. And this is the analogy I've heard. I used to use it when I was a regulator, and I heard other regulators since using it. Don't build a car and say this car can only go 75 miles an hour, and then complain about the speed limit. Oh, you can't make our car do that. Our car was built precisely so that it can't do that. There are solutions out there. One of the things that the FATF report did say was we really appreciate how much innovation has been formed around this. Some private-public partnerships, some private organizations and tech developers to come up with travel rule solutions. Because I think the reality is that if that doesn't get implemented, then I think there's look, there are going to be interoperability issues. There are going to be implementation issues. But the reality is that if the travel rule doesn't come into play, law enforcement gets a huge blind spot in this space. And all those headlines on page on the very beginning of the slide that we talked about, those are just going to be the tip of the iceberg.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Greg, for being with us. This was really interesting, and we appreciate your time. We'll have a next episode of this webinar series in about a month, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you so much. It's great to speak to you.